Most men experience their lives as something that happens to them. They respond to conditions rather than creating them. They react to the people around them rather than positioning themselves deliberately. They make decisions from the narrow vantage point of the immediate moment rather than from the elevated perspective of the man who has thought 3 moves ahead and arranged the terrain accordingly. They drift, not from laziness, not necessarily, often from genuine effort and genuine intention. But effort without architecture produces motion without direction. And motion without direction, however sustained, however disciplined in its own way, is not the same thing as building. It is simply moving. And the man who has spent decades moving without building eventually looks around and realizes that the life surrounding him was not designed. It accumulated, piece by piece, response by response, reaction by reaction, until what stands around him is not a structure he chose, but a collection of circumstances he adapted to. And somewhere in the quiet between busy days, he feels the weight of that distinction. Niccolò Machiavelli was the first systematic thinker in the Western tradition to treat the design of one's position in the world as a legitimate and serious intellectual project, not a moral question, not primarily a strategic one. He looked at the men who shaped history and the men who were shaped by it and asked what the difference was, not at the level of talent or luck or character in its conventional sense, but at the level of thinking, of how a man understood the forces operating around him and what he did with that understanding. And what he found was not a formula for cruelty, though the men who read him carelessly have always preferred that interpretation. What he found was something far more demanding and far more useful, the operating principles of the man who takes genuine responsibility for the shape of his own reality rather than accepting the shape reality assigns him by default. We are calling that man the Machiavellian architect, and the word architect is chosen deliberately. An architect does not simply respond to the materials in front of him. He studies them. He understands their properties and their limits and their possibilities. He designs with those properties in mind. He builds in sequence, understanding that what comes later depends on what's established first. He thinks about load-bearing structures before he thinks about the details. He knows that beauty in the finished thing depends on integrity in the hidden foundation, and he takes responsibility fully and without excuse for what the structure becomes. He does not say the conditions were wrong or the materials were difficult. He accounts for the conditions. He works with the materials. He builds anyway. These 7 lessons are the architectural principles of that kind of man. Not dark in the sense of cruel, dark in the sense of honest about things most men prefer not to look at directly. If you are ready to look, you are in the right place. And if the combination of strategic depth and genuine philosophical grounding is what brings you here, subscribe. This channel exists for the man who is serious about building something real, rather than simply accumulating something accidental. Lesson 1. Reality is the only material worth building. With the architect's first discipline, before any design, before any plan, before any structural decision of any kind, is an honest survey of the actual conditions. Not the conditions he wishes existed, not the conditions that would make his preferred design easier to execute. The conditions that actually exist. The load the ground will actually bear. The weather the structure will actually face. The materials that are actually available. Any design that begins from fantasy rather than reality will eventually meet reality, and that meeting is always more expensive than the honest survey would have been. Machiavelli's foundational contribution to serious thinking about power and strategy was exactly this, the insistence on seeing things as they are rather than as they should be. He wrote that the gap between how men live and how they ought to live is so large that the man who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. He was not saying that ideals are worthless. He was saying that a man who navigates by ideals, while the terrain is shaped by realities, will perpetually be surprised by what the terrain does to his plans. He will be generous when the situation calls for firmness, trusting when the situation calls for verification, open when the situation calls for discretion, and he will call his resulting difficulties bad luck rather than bad seeing. By the man who builds his life on accurate perception rather than comfortable distortion has an advantage so fundamental that almost every other advantage follows from it. He makes better decisions because he is deciding about what is actually happening rather than what he prefers to be happening. He anticipates problems before they arrive because he is willing to see where a current trajectory leads, rather than looking away from that projection because it is unpleasant. He reads people accurately because he is committed to watching what they actually do rather than receiving what they say and preferring it to the behavioral evidence. He positions himself correctly because he understands where the actual forces are, what they actually want, and how they actually move, rather than how they present themselves in the language of stated intention. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with the rigor of a man who understood that an emperor who cannot see clearly is an emperor who cannot govern. He wrote in his private journals about the practice of stripping away the narrative from every situation and seeing what remained, of looking at the thing itself rather than the story told about it, of holding his own preferences and wishes at a distance sufficient to ask honestly, what is actually true here? That practice is not pessimism. It is not coldness. It is the prerequisite of every other form of genuine capability, because you cannot build well on ground you have not honestly surveyed. You can only build on the ground you imagined, and then wait for the ground you actually have to reveal itself through the cracks in what you built. The specific discipline this requires in daily life is the discipline of honest discomfort, of being willing to know things you would prefer not to know, of receiving information that contradicts your preferred understanding of a situation without immediately reworking the information to fit the understanding rather than updating the understanding to fit the information, of asking the questions that might return answers you are not yet ready to act on. This is not easy. The human nervous system is exquisitely designed to filter information in ways that protect the coherence of its existing model of the world. Seeing accurately, consistently, and in the face of inconvenient evidence requires deliberate practice against a very strong current. But the man who develops that practice builds everything else on ground that will hold it, and the man who doesn't is always, at some level, building on sand he has chosen not to look at directly. Lesson 2. Design your positioning before the moment of need. The architect does not design under deadline pressure what should have been designed in deliberate quiet. The decisions that determine whether a structure stands or falls are made long before the structure is tested. The load-bearing choices, the foundational commitments, the placement of the walls that will carry everything above them, these are made in the calm of the design phase, with the full capacity of the architect's attention, without the distorting pressure of crisis or urgency or the particular confusion of a mind that is trying to act and think simultaneously. Machiavelli observed this pattern with striking consistency across the historical record he studied. The rulers who endured adversity were almost always the ones who had built their position before the adversity arrived, who had established genuine relationships rather than transactional ones before they needed something from those relationships, who had built genuine capability, genuine resources, genuine reputation before the moment when all three would be tested simultaneously. And the rulers who were destroyed, often despite significant native talent and genuine effort at the moment of crisis, were the ones who arrived at the crisis having built nothing in the preceding calm. Who had to improvise in the fire what should have been constructed in the warmth? And improvisation under fire is always more expensive than construction in calm. This is the principle the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of difficulty, the practice of thinking forward clearly and honestly to the conditions your life will likely face, and building the capacity to meet those conditions before they arrive rather than at the moment they demand response. Seneca practiced it systematically. He would imagine in his private hours the losses and reversals and adversities that a life of genuine exposure inevitably produces, not to generate anxiety, to generate readiness, to ensure that when difficulty came, as it always did, he was meeting it with a mind that had already thought through the territory, rather than a mind encountering it for the first time in the worst possible conditions for clear thought. For the man serious about building his reality rather than simply inhabiting it, this principle translates into a very specific practice, the practice of designing your position in every domain of importance, financial, relational, professional, physical, intellectual, in the calm periods rather than waiting for the pressure of necessity to force the design. Building your financial foundation before you need it to absorb a loss, rather than after. Building your network of genuine relationships before you need something from those relationships, rather than at the moment of need. Building your physical capacity before your health demands it, rather than after. You're building your reputation for reliability and integrity in the ordinary days rather than trying to construct it in the crisis when it matters most. The man who does this consistently operates from a position of genuine security that has nothing to do with arrogance or complacency. He is secure because he has actually built something, because the structure he is operating from was designed under conditions of clarity rather than assembled under conditions of desperation. And that difference between the designed position and the desperate improvisation is visible in everything he does, in the quality of his decisions, in the stability of his presence under pressure, in the specific confidence that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the genuine knowledge that what he has built can bear the weight of whatever difficulty arrives. Lesson 3. Understand the forces before you try to direct them. The architect who does not understand the properties of his materials will eventually be surprised by them. He will place weight on something that cannot bear it. He will use something for a purpose it was not designed for. He will build a joint that looks solid until the stress that it was not designed for arrives and reveals, with sudden and complete authority, exactly what it was actually capable of and what it was not. Understanding the material is not optional preparation. It is the work itself. Everything built on inadequate understanding of the material will eventually conform to what the material actually is, rather than what the builder believed it to be. Machiavelli's most consistently useful contribution to strategic thinking is his analysis of human nature as a kind of material, not in the sense of treating people as objects, but in the sense of understanding people accurately, understanding what actually motivates human behavior as opposed to what people say motivates it, understanding the predictable patterns through which self-interest expresses itself, understanding the consistent ways in which flattery operates on men who are susceptible to it, and honest challenge operates on men who are not, understanding the specific mechanics of loyalty, when it holds and when it dissolves, and what the difference between those two states looks like from the outside before the dissolution makes it obvious. This is not cynicism. It is what Carl Jung was also pointing at when he wrote about the importance of making the unconscious conscious. Projection, which is the mechanism by which unconscious forces operate through us without our awareness, is not only a psychological phenomenon in the individual, it is a social phenomenon that runs constantly in every human group and organization and relationship. The man who does not understand it, who takes people's stated motivations entirely at face value, who does not ask what a person's behavior pattern is communicating beneath what their words are saying, will be governed by forces he cannot see. See, he will be outmaneuvered by dynamics he did not perceive. He will be genuinely confused by events that were, to the man with clearer sight, entirely predictable from the pattern that had been developing for months or years. The practical discipline here is the same one we discussed in the first lesson, but applied specifically to people and organizations rather than to situations. It is the discipline of watching behavior over time and allowing that behavioral pattern to update your understanding of a person's actual operating principles, not their stated principles, their demonstrated ones, the ones revealed under pressure, in the moments when stated and actual diverge, and the actual shows itself. The architect who understands his materials can design with them. He can use their actual properties rather than fighting against them or being surprised by them. The man who understands the human forces operating in his environment can position himself relative to those forces rather than simply being positioned by them, which is what happens to every man who has not done this work. This understanding must include, critically, the honest study of yourself as a force to be understood, your own patterns, your own predictable responses to specific kinds of pressure, your own susceptibilities to specific kinds of flattery or manipulation, the places where your judgment reliably clouds, and what the cloud looks like from the inside so that you can recognize it before it fully obscures your sight. The Stoics called this self-examination the foundation of every other form of wisdom, and they were right. Because the man who understands every force operating around him but does not understand himself as a force operating within himself is the architect who has surveyed every aspect of the site except the ground directly beneath his feet. Lesson 4. Control the narrative or someone else. Will every situation that involves more than one person generates a narrative, a story about what is happening, why it is happening, who is responsible for it, and what it means. That narrative is not neutral. It shapes perception. It determines how information is interpreted, how behavior is evaluated, how positions are understood relative to each other. And the narrative is always shaped by someone. The only question the architect must answer is whether he will be among the shapers or entirely among the shaped. Machiavelli understood the power of narrative at a level that was remarkable for the early 16th century and remains entirely current. He observed that men judge things by their appearances more than by their actual qualities because appearances are available to everyone, while the accurate judgment of actual qualities requires a depth of investigation that most people, most of the time, will not undertake. This is not a criticism of human intelligence. It is an accurate observation about human attention. People operate from the narrative available to them, and the narrative available to them is the one that has been most effectively communicated, most clearly framed, most consistently reinforced. Which means the man who does not actively participate in shaping the narrative of his own situation surrenders that shaping to whoever is most motivated and most capable of doing it. And those people will shape it in accordance with their own interests, which may or may not align with his. This principle operates at every scale. In the organization where your work is evaluated, the narrative about what you contribute and why it matters and how it should be understood is being actively shaped at all times by the people who have interests in how it is shaped. The man who believes his work speaks for itself, who relies entirely on the objective quality of what he produces rather than on any active participation in how it is understood, will consistently be outpositioned by people of lesser quality who have understood that quality without communication is invisible. In the relationship where your behavior is interpreted, the narrative your partner or your family or your closest associates hold about who you are and what drives you is being updated by information you are constantly providing, either deliberately or by default. The man who never thinks about what that information is communicating is not thereby freed from its communicative effects. He is simply unaware of them. In the community or the social context where your reputation lives, the story told about you is being shaped by every interaction, every public decision, every moment of character revealed or concealed in conditions that matter. None of this requires inauthenticity. The Stoic tradition would refuse any version of this principle that required performing a self you are not. The integrated man, the one whose external presentation genuinely reflects his internal character, has the cleanest possible relationship to this principle, because for him, shaping the narrative means nothing more complex than being intentional about how his genuine character is communicated. It means not hiding his actual values in the misguided belief that the values will be evident without expression. It means being clear about his intentions rather than assuming they are obvious. It means taking the communication of what he actually is and what he actually does as seriously as he takes the being and doing themselves. Because a life well lived that no one in the relevant space understands is a life that cannot generate the influence, the relationships, or the opportunities that a life well lived and well communicated can. Lesson 5. Build structures that function without your constant presence. The architect's highest achievement is not the structure that requires his continuous presence to remain standing. It is the structure that embodies his design so completely, so intelligently, so honestly aligned with the forces that will act upon it, that it stands by the logic of its own construction, rather than by the ongoing effort of its creator. The greatest buildings in history do not need their architects to remain upright. They stand because the principles of their construction are sound, because the design anticipated the loads, because the materials were right for the purpose, because the architecture was done well enough that it no longer requires the architect. Machiavelli observed that the prince who must be personally present in every decision, who cannot leave his territory without it immediately destabilizing, who has built his position around his own continuous attention rather than around sound institutional structures and reliable people and clear operating principles, has not built a principality. He has built a dependency, and dependencies are fragile in direct proportion to the reliability of the thing they depend on. The moment the prince is ill or distracted or absent for any reason, the structure begins to reveal what it was always made of, not sound design, but continuous effort holding together a design that was never sound enough to stand alone. This translates directly into the life of the Machiavellian architect operating outside of principalities. The professional who builds systems, processes, and genuinely capable people around him is building something that generates value whether or not he is physically present and continuously directing it. The professional who keeps all the critical knowledge in his own head and all the critical decisions dependent on his personal approval has not built an organization. He has built a machine that runs on his continuous presence, and that machine cannot outlast him, cannot grow beyond his personal bandwidth, and cannot produce the kind of compounding results that only become available when a system is sound enough to operate intelligently without constant intervention. The man who builds genuine structures, whether professional, financial, relational, or habitual, that function on the logic of their own design rather than on his continuous personal energy, builds something genuinely larger than himself. The man who does not builds only as large as his personal presence can reach, which is always, always smaller than what is possible. The habits you build are structures. The financial systems you establish are structures. The norms and standards you embed in your professional environment are structures. The relational patterns you establish with the people who matter are structures. And the question the architect must ask of every structure he builds is not only whether it works right now with his full attention on it, but whether it will work when his attention is elsewhere, whether it embeds the right principles deeply enough to function by those principles rather than by his continuous supervision. Because the life built on continuous personal effort without sound underlying structure is a life that is always one sustained difficulty away from collapse. And the life built on sound underlying structures is the life that continues to compound even in the seasons when its architect is being tested by exactly the kind of adversity that tests everything. Lesson 6. Know the difference between what can be changed and what must be accepted. The Stoics and Machiavelli are in more complete agreement on this principle than on almost any other, and it is the principle that most separates the effective builder from the man who wastes his architectural resources on terrain that cannot be moved. Epictetus began his entire philosophical system with the distinction between what is in our power and what is not, and Machiavelli's parallel distinction between what fortune controls and what the prepared man can manage covers essentially the same territory from a different angle. Both are pointing at the same discipline, the accurate identification of where your agency actually operates, and the ruthless concentration of your design effort within that space rather than dispersed across the much larger space of everything that concerns you, including the things you cannot affect. The man who cannot make this distinction wastes enormous energy. He exhausts himself fighting forces that are not going to move because no person in his position could move them, while neglecting to build in the areas where genuine construction is available to him. He blames circumstances that are genuinely beyond his influence for outcomes that were actually determined by his failure to build well in the spaces where building was possible. And he develops, over time, the specific bitterness of the man who feels the world has been unfair to him without ever honestly examining whether the unfairness was in the world's actual structure or in his own misreading of where his agency genuinely applied. The architect's discipline here is what Machiavelli called the management of fortune. He used the image of a river. Fortune, he wrote, is like a flood river that when it rages overflows the plains, ruins trees and buildings, shifts the earth from one place to another. But when it is not raging, men can make provision against it with dikes and other defenses, so that when it rises it will flow into a canal. You cannot stop the river. You can absolutely determine whether there are dikes in place when it rises. And the man who has spent his calm seasons building dikes is a fundamentally different figure in the flood than the man who has spent those seasons ignoring the river because it wasn't flooding yet. This requires a specific honest reckoning that most men avoid because it touches something they would prefer to believe about the world. It requires admitting that some things, including things you care about deeply, and that seem profoundly unfair in their resistance to your effort, are genuinely not within your power to change. The market conditions you are operating in, the early disadvantages you were given, the specific configuration of forces in your professional environment that would take a decade and a different position to move meaningfully, these are real constraints. Acknowledging them is not defeatism. It is the honest survey that allows you to concentrate your design energy where design can actually do something. The man who acknowledges his genuine constraints can work around them, build in spite of them, sometimes find indirect paths through them that direct confrontation would have missed entirely. The man who refuses to acknowledge them wastes everything he has, attempting to move what will not move, and wakes up years later on the same ground, having exhausted himself for negligible progress, wondering why his enormous effort produced so little result. The flip side of this discipline is equally important and equally demanding. It requires refusing the excuse of constraint for outcomes that were actually within your power. The honest reckoning goes both ways. Yes, acknowledge what you genuinely cannot change, and refuse to classify as unchangeable what you simply found too difficult or too uncomfortable to change. The Stoics were pitiless about this particular form of self-deception. They insisted that the domain of genuine human agency is larger than comfort suggests, and that most men contract their perceived domain of agency to the size of their current willingness to act rather than to the actual size of what is available to them. The architect's discipline is to see both constraints clearly, what actually cannot be moved, and what can be moved if you are willing to apply the genuine effort that moving it requires. Lesson 7. The architect is always the first structure he must build. There is a principle beneath every other principle in this video, and it is the one that separates the man who applies these lessons strategically from the outside and the man who embodies them as expressions of something genuinely built within. Every architectural capability we have discussed, the ability to see clearly, to design in advance, to understand human forces accurately, to shape narratives, to build structures that stand without continuous effort, to identify the genuine boundaries of agency, all of it is mediated by the instrument doing the work. And that instrument is you, your attention, your judgment, your integrity, your capacity for sustained effort in the right direction, your ability to remain oriented to genuine principle when the pressures that would have you compromise that principle are immediate and the returns to principle are distant. All of these are capacities, and capacities are built, or they are not built, but they are not given. Machiavelli studied external architecture, the arrangement of states and alliances and institutions and positions. What he underestimated, and what the Stoic tradition had always understood with greater clarity, is that the most fundamental architecture is internal. The man whose inner world is sound, whose values are genuinely held rather than performed, whose judgment is clear because his self-knowledge is honest, whose commitments are reliable because the distance between what he says and what he does has been closed through years of deliberate practice, that man has a foundation that no purely external architecture can replicate or substitute for. And the man whose inner world is disordered, who is being run by unexamined patterns and unacknowledged fears and the accumulated weight of a self he has never honestly surveyed, that man will corrupt every external structure he attempts to build, because the structures will express the builder. They always do. Marcus Aurelius understood this as the central challenge of a life of genuine power. He had everything external, more external power than any man of his era, and most men of any era, and he spent every private hour building the internal architecture without which the external was, he clearly believed, not merely insufficient but actively dangerous. He wrote about the necessity of examining himself with the same rigor he applied to everything else, of holding his own behavior to the standard of his stated values rather than to the more comfortable standard of what was convenient or what the moment seemed to require, of treating his own character as the most important project under construction at all times, regardless of what else was demanding his attention. This is not self-absorption. It is the opposite of self-absorption in its truest sense. It is the recognition that the quality of everything you build, every relationship, every professional structure, every habit, every decision made in conditions of genuine difficulty is determined by the quality of the instrument making it. And the instrument requires maintenance, It requires honest examination. It requires the willingness to identify where it is not performing to the standard you have set, and to do the actual work of correction rather than the comfortable work of rationalization. It requires, in short, the same discipline applied to yourself that Machiavelli prescribed for the management of every other domain of importance: honest seeing, deliberate design, patient construction, and the refusal to mistake what is for what is simply more comfortable to believe. The Jungian tradition adds the specific dimension the Stoic tradition and Machiavelli both point at but do not map as explicitly: the necessity of meeting the parts of yourself that the persona has not included, the shadow material, the unexplored interior, the qualities and drives and fears and desires that are operating beneath the surface of your conscious self-understanding and shaping your decisions and your relationships and your patterns in ways you cannot see because you have not yet chosen to look. The architect who has not surveyed his own foundation is always building on uncertainty he has chosen not to investigate. And the foundation, eventually, will reveal what it actually is. It always does. The question is only whether the revelation comes gradually through honest self-examination or suddenly through structural failure at the worst possible moment. Build the inner man first, not instead of the outer structures, but first, in the sense of precedence, of priority, of the honest recognition that everything else depends on this. The clarity of your perception depends on the clarity of your interior. The integrity of your decisions depends on the integrity of your character. The durability of your structures depends on the durability of your commitment to the principles that make structure sound. You are the first and most important thing you will ever build. Every other project takes place inside the scope of that one, and the man who builds that one well, honestly and continuously, and without the convenient shortcuts that produce the appearance of internal development, without the substance of it, is the man whose other projects have the only foundation worth building on.